Hello and welcome to the first of our weekly videos introducing the week's topics in the Plato's Theory of Form lecture course. This week we're going to look at the question of how we could know what Plato's theory of forms was. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to these three individuals. First, in the middle here is Socrates. He died in 399 BC, didn't leave any writings himself. However, his principal student Plato wrote extensively on the theory of forms and various other topics, and his works have come down to us in the form of dialogues. His student Aristotle also wrote a large corpus of philosophical works which have survived. However, they're in treatise form. They represent Aristotle's own views in person. The interplay between these three individuals is going to form an important part of trying to understand how we can know what Plato's theory of forms was. Very briefly then, first of all, what the forms were. The forms are mind-independent instances of concepts which explain why all of those instances are that thing. So for example, Plato talks about the form of beauty, which is mind-independent in the sense that it exists independently of humans and their cognition and will continue to exist even if all human beings cease to be, or if human beings can't cognitively access them. It's independent of human beings, but it also explains the way in which each beautiful thing is beautiful by a kind of relationship which Plato calls participation. So that's the kind of work that the forms do. How could we know what Plato's theory was? Well, the first possible answer to that is, as illustrated by this slide here, thinking. That is to say, we could think ourselves into Plato's position, look at the kinds of philosophical problems he introduced the forms to solve, and then reason a priori about them and come up with roughly what the shape of the theory of forms should be. The problem with this approach is that it will never get us exactly to what Plato's view of the theory of forms was, although it might get us to some kind of related view of universals. If we're interested in what Plato's particular view of the forms was, we have to do some reading, as illustrated by this slide. That is, we have to read Plato's texts and possibly the texts of those who knew Plato's work very well. So what form did these texts take? Well, this slide here is a medieval woodcut illustrating what the artist took to be the relationship between Plato and Socrates. Unfortunately, those two characters are mislabeled, so I'm just going to switch the labels around. Socrates, there at the back, is directing Plato as if Plato was some kind of amanuensis, just doing the writing down Socrates' own views. Now, there's a grain of truth in this, right? Socrates appears as a principal character in many of Plato's dialogues, but it's not clear that Socrates directed Plato explicitly and Plato is just recording what Socrates thought. What happens really is Plato is presenting a dramatization of Socrates' views. He's presenting a drama in which philosophical ideas, as expounded by various characters, in many cases a character called Socrates, are explored. But what that means is that you can never read off the dialogues Plato's own views in propria persona. So if we're interested in what Plato's theory of forms was, we have to do some quite detailed reconstructive work to find that out. This is an illumination from a 13th century manuscript of Aristotle's Metaphysics, and what it shows is Aristotle teaching a class of students, each of whom have a set of lecture notes. Now, Aristotle's writings took this form, that is, they were lecture notes, either written by him or his students. What does that mean? Well, it means that we can tell what Aristotle's views were in propria persona. Aristotle tells us what he thinks about ethics, what he thinks about metaphysics, what he thinks about the forms. He also tells us what Plato thought about the forms, and along with various other kinds of recorded material. So we can use Aristotle's texts to try to get access to what Plato's theory of forms was. However, the difficulty with this approach isn't that Aristotle never talks to us in propria persona, but Aristotle has his own agenda. This detail from Raphael's School of Athens illustrates the relationship between Plato and Aristotle, or what Raphael took to be the relationship between Plato and Aristotle. Plato here on the left is pointing upwards, and Aristotle is making this weird palm down gesture towards the ground. And what's supposed to be illustrated here is Plato's preoccupation with divine heavenly matters such as the forms, contrasted with Aristotle's preoccupation with temporally bounded substances which are individuals in the world around us, and with biology and physics and chemistry, as opposed to Plato's preoccupation with the forms and metaphysics and so on. So there's a contrast here in approach, and Aristotle's reports of Plato may be distorting Plato's views for Aristotelian purposes. And the final problem with both approaches is that there are contradictions. There are contradictions within Plato's corpus about the forms, so about what forms there are, about whether the forms are coherent, and there are contradictions between Plato's reports and Aristotle's reports, or Plato's texts describing the forms and Aristotle's reports of those texts. So these contradictions have to be resolved. And in the lecture, we're going to look at some of the ways in which the contradictions within Plato's texts and between Plato and Aristotle have been approached by scholars.